Before the bullets, before the beaches, before the medals, before the nightmares, there was only a letter, a single sheet of paper, thin enough to fold into a pocket, powerful enough to change the course of a life forever. It arrived without ceremony. No marching band, no patriotic speech, just the familiar sound of a mailbox opening on an ordinary morning in 1942. You already knew what it was before you touched it. Every young American man did. For months, families across the country had watched sons, brothers, neighbors, and classmates receive the same envelope. One after another, they disappeared onto trains heading toward places with names that would soon become part of history. Now, it was your turn. The words at the top sounded strangely polite. Greetings. An odd choice. There was nothing welcoming about the letter in your hands. It informed you that your country required your service. You were ordered to report for military induction on a specific date and time. Failure to appear wasn't simply frowned upon. It was a crime. Just like that, your future no longer belonged to you. Whether you dreamed of becoming a farmer, a mechanic, a teacher, or an engineer, those dreams would have to wait. If they survived at all. Maybe you had volunteered after Pearl Harbor. Like thousands of others, you'd stood outside a recruiting office believing the war would be over by Christmas. Or maybe you waited, hoping someone else would fight, hoping diplomacy, or distance, or simple luck would spare you. It didn't matter anymore. Volunteer or draftee, everyone eventually wore the same uniform. The induction center was crowded. Hundreds of young men stood in long lines beneath bright lights, each trying very hard to look braver than he felt. Some joked, some smoked, some stared silently at the floor. Nobody wanted to admit what everyone was thinking. What if I don't come back? The fear wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It hung in the air like humidity before a summer storm. Then came the medical examination. It was fast, impersonal, efficient. Doctors measured your height, checked your vision, listened to your heart, examined your teeth, tested your hearing. They searched for anything that might disqualify you. Flat feet, poor eyesight, a heart condition, bad lungs, anything. Most secretly hoped the doctor would find something. Anything. A reason to send them home. Most walked out disappointed. Healthy, fit, approved, perfect candidates for war. Outside the building, the world looked exactly the same. Cars still rolled down the streets. Children still played on sidewalks. People still laughed inside cafes. It felt almost insulting. How could life continue as though nothing had changed? When yours had changed completely. You were given a short leave before reporting for training. Just enough time to go home. To pack. To say goodbye. To pretend it wasn't goodbye. Your mother cooked your favorite meal. She smiled throughout dinner. But she barely ate. Every few minutes, she found another excuse to stand up. Another dish to wash. Another glass to refill. Anything to hide the tears beginning to gather in her eyes. Your father handled it differently. He spoke less than usual. When he finally did, his advice came in only a few words. Do your job. It sounded simple. You both knew it wasn't. Your younger siblings didn't understand. To them, you were just leaving on another trip. Maybe they'd see you next month. Maybe by Christmas. Children measure time differently. Adults understand that sometimes goodbye really does mean goodbye. That night, you lay awake in your childhood bedroom. Everything around you suddenly felt important. The baseball glove hanging on the wall. The cracked dresser your father built years ago. The faint glow from the street lamp outside your window. The distant whistle of a passing train. You had seen these things every day of your life. Now, you wondered if you were seeing them for the last time. Sleep never really came. Only morning did. The station platform was crowded with families saying the same painful farewell. Mothers hugged sons until conductors politely separated them. Young wives kissed husbands who had barely learned how to be husbands. Sweethearts exchanged promises that neither could possibly guarantee. I'll wait. All right. I'll come home. 3 simple promises. Each made with complete sincerity. Each impossible to control. War has a habit of breaking promises made by good people. The train whistle sounded. Steam drifted across the platform. One final embrace. One final wave. One final look through the window. Then, the train began to move. Slowly at first. Almost gently. As though giving everyone one last chance to change their minds. No one could. The platform slipped farther away. Your family became smaller. Then smaller still. Until they disappeared completely. You kept looking long after they were gone. Because looking away somehow made everything feel more real. Inside the carriage, dozens of young men sat quietly. Some tried reading newspapers. Others played cards. A few stared out the window, just as you did. Nobody talked much. There wasn't much left to say. The countryside rolled past in silence. Farms, churches, small towns, places untouched by war. Places that suddenly felt impossibly distant. Hours later, the train slowed. You stepped onto the platform carrying a small duffel bag that contained everything the army had allowed you to bring. Ahead stood rows of wooden barracks, endless fences, training fields, watchtowers, and waiting near the entrance was a man wearing a campaign hat. His uniform looked perfect. His boots shined like black glass. His expression suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. The moment the first recruit stepped off the train, he exploded, not with bullets, with words, louder than anything you'd ever heard. Move. Faster. What are you waiting for? Within seconds, the confused crowd became a frantic wave of bodies scrambling in every direction. Someone dropped a suitcase. Someone else froze. The shouting only grew louder. It wasn't personal. Not yet. The army had one goal: to strip away the civilian before building the soldier. And by the end of your very first hour, you were already beginning to understand something terrifying. The draft letter hadn't been the beginning of your war. It had only been the invitation. The army didn't ask who you had been. It didn't care. Not really. Back home, you might have been the star quarterback, or a college student studying law. Maybe you worked 12-hour shifts at a steel mill. Maybe you had never spent a night away from your hometown. The moment you stepped through the gates, every one of those identities disappeared. From now on, you weren't Tom, or Jack, or Robert. You were a recruit. One face among thousands. One more civilian the army intended to rebuild from the ground up. And they had only a few weeks to do it. The transformation began before sunrise. Long before. The first sound wasn't birds. It wasn't traffic. It was a whistle, followed immediately by a voice that seemed capable of shaking the walls. On your feet. The room exploded into chaos. Men stumbled from bunks, still half asleep. Someone pulled on another man's boots by mistake. Someone else couldn't find his belt. Blankets flew. Lockers slammed. Within minutes, dozens of terrified recruits were sprinting toward formation, desperately hoping they wouldn't be the last one outside. Because being last always came with consequences. The drill sergeants seemed almost superhuman. They never looked tired, never seemed cold, never appeared to lose their voices despite shouting from dawn until long after sunset. It didn't matter what you did. There was always something wrong. Your boots weren't polished enough. Your bed wasn't tight enough. Your rifle wasn't clean enough. You weren't standing straight enough. You weren't moving fast enough. If perfection existed, they weren't interested in reaching it. They were interested in making you chase it. Because battle doesn't reward good enough. Within days, your hair was gone. One by one, recruits filed into the barber shop. The barber barely looked at your face. The clippers buzzed once, twice, and years of carefully combed hair fell silently onto the floor. The entire process lasted less than a minute. When you looked into the mirror, someone else stared back. The haircut wasn't about appearance. It was about equality. No rich kids. No poor kids. No athletes. No artists. Everyone looked the same. The army had begun erasing individuality, one strand of hair at a time. Then came the uniforms. Fresh olive drab, heavy wool, stiff leather boots that felt like they had been carved from wood. They looked impressive for about 5 minutes. Then you had to march in them. Blisters appeared almost immediately. Heels bled. Toes swelled. Some recruits wrapped their feet in extra socks. Others stuffed paper inside their boots hoping it would help. Nothing helped much. Every evening, men compared blisters the way fishermen compare catches. The strange part? Nobody complained for long. Because everyone hurt. Pain became normal remarkably fast. The days blended together with mechanical precision. Physical training. Close order drill. Weapons instruction. Obstacle courses. More marching. Always marching. If you weren't marching, you were running. If you weren't running, someone was yelling because you should have been. Meals arrived almost as interruptions rather than breaks. You learned to eat quickly. Very quickly. Breakfast wasn't something to enjoy. It was fuel. You had minutes. Sometimes less. The army had no interest in teaching patience at the dinner table. The rifle became your constant companion. At first, it felt awkward, heavy, unfamiliar, cold against your hands. The instructors corrected every mistake. How you carried it, how you aimed it, how you cleaned it, how you slept beside it. This rifle will keep you alive, one instructor repeated so often that eventually nobody noticed he was saying it anymore. Then he would pause. And if you don't take care of it, it won't. Those words stayed with many recruits long after training ended. Shooting wasn't what surprised most men. Missing did. Movies make marksmanship look instinctive. Reality was humbling. Targets stood perfectly still. The weather cooperated. Nobody was shooting back. And still, many recruits missed. Again and again. The instructors weren't disappointed. They expected it. Accuracy wasn't something you arrived with. It was something you earned. One careful breath at a time. The obstacle course humbled almost everyone. Rope climbs, high walls, barbed wire, mud, logs, ditches. Every obstacle seemed designed by someone who genuinely disliked human comfort. Halfway through, your lungs burned. Your arms shook. Your uniform weighed twice what it had that morning after soaking through with sweat. Some men wanted to quit. Most never said it aloud. Because everyone else looked equally exhausted. Pride can carry a person farther than strength ever will. At night, the barracks finally grew quiet. Not because the work was finished. Because exhaustion had defeated conversation. Boots sat beside bunks. Uniforms hung neatly from lockers. The smell of boot polish mixed with damp wool and sweat. Someone quietly wrote a letter home beneath a dim light. Another stared at an old family photograph before slipping it back into his wallet. A third simply closed his eyes, too tired to think. The letters became lifelines. Every few days, mail call echoed through the barracks. Instantly, every head turned. For a few minutes, the army disappeared. One man smiled after reading about his newborn daughter. Another laughed at a joke his brother had written. Someone quietly folded a letter without saying a word. He'd just learned. His father had died. War doesn't always wait until the battlefield to begin taking things away. Friendships formed in strange ways. You didn't choose them. They happened. The kid from Brooklyn who talked too much. The farm boy from Iowa who had never seen a skyscraper. The mechanic from Detroit who could fix almost anything. The schoolteacher from Kansas who somehow stayed calm through everything. Men who would never have met in civilian life suddenly became inseparable. Shared misery has a remarkable way of creating loyalty. You stopped thinking in terms of I. Without realizing it, you started saying we. One evening, after another endless day of drills, your instructor gathered everyone together. For once, he wasn't shouting. He looked slowly across the exhausted faces standing before him. Then he said something none of you expected. Most of you think this is hard. He paused. It isn't. The silence that followed felt heavier than any shouted command. This, he said quietly, is the easy part. No one laughed. No one moved. Because for the first time since arriving, every recruit understood exactly what training was preparing them for. Somewhere beyond these fences, beyond the firing ranges, beyond the obstacle courses, real bullets were waiting. And unlike the drill sergeants, they wouldn't give you another chance. There is a moment in every soldier's training when something changes. It doesn't happen during a parade or when you're handed a rifle. It happens quietly, almost without you noticing. One day, you're practicing. The next, you realize you're preparing to take another human life. And that's a line no one crosses easily. The instructors understood something that civilians rarely did. Most people don't naturally want to kill, despite everything you've seen in movies, despite all the patriotic posters, despite the speeches. Human beings are deeply reluctant to pull the trigger on another person. The Army knew that, which meant training wasn't just about building stronger muscles. It was about reshaping instinct, replacing hesitation with action. The firing range became your second home. Every morning, rows of recruits lay shoulder to shoulder in the dirt. The rifles cracked in perfect rhythm. Pop, pop, pop. The smell of burnt gunpowder drifted across the field. Empty brass casings bounced against the ground like tiny pieces of gold. The instructors walked silently behind the firing line, watching, correcting, never praising. If you hit the target, that was expected. If you missed, everyone knew about it. At first, the targets were simple circles, black rings painted on white paper. No faces, no bodies, just numbers. The Army wasn't trying to make you hate anyone. Hatred was unpredictable. Discipline wasn't. The goal wasn't rage. It was repetition. Raise the rifle. Steady your breathing. Squeeze. Don't pull the trigger. Again, 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 until your hands moved before your brain had time to doubt itself. Then came moving targets. Wooden silhouettes sliding across rails. They appeared without warning, sometimes for only a few seconds. You had to react immediately. No hesitation. No second guessing. The instructors weren't measuring courage. They were measuring time. Because somewhere, across an ocean, hesitation lasted just long enough to get someone killed. Maybe you. Maybe the man standing beside you. The grenade course terrified almost everyone. Holding a live grenade for the first time felt wrong. It was surprisingly small, heavy, cold. It fit easily inside your palm, which somehow made it even more frightening. One mistake, one dropped grenade, 1 second too late, and everything changed forever. The instructor demonstrated calmly. Pull the pin. Count. Throw. Hit the dirt. Simple. Until it was your turn. When the explosion came, you felt it before you heard it. The shockwave punched through your chest. Dirt rained down around the trench. The ground itself seemed to jump. The instructor smiled. Not because explosions were exciting, because now you understood their power. No lecture could have taught that lesson. Only experience could. Bayonet training felt different. Personal. The rifle was no longer a weapon fired from a distance. It became a spear. The instructors stood before rows of recruits shouting commands. Lunge. Thrust. Again. 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 Wooden dummies absorbed thousands of blows. Some had painted faces. Others wore old helmets. The point wasn't anger. The point was removing hesitation. Because on a battlefield, hesitation could be fatal. One afternoon, your platoon entered what looked like a small village. Wooden buildings, fences, windows. It looked almost peaceful. Then whistles blew. Machine guns erupted with blank ammunition. Smoke grenades exploded. Instructors screamed contradictory orders from every direction. Men scattered instinctively. Some froze. Others ran the wrong way. Within seconds, the carefully organized formation dissolved into confusion, exactly as planned. Afterward, the instructors gathered everyone together. Nobody yelled this time. They simply explained what had happened. War is confusion. One of them pointed toward the mock village. It doesn't matter how smart you are. It doesn't matter how brave you think you are. When bullets start flying, your body will fall back on exactly what you've practiced. Nothing more. Nothing less. Training wasn't teaching you what to do. It was deciding what your instincts would become. The hardest lessons weren't physical. They happened at night. Sometimes, after lights out, the barracks grew unusually quiet. Someone would mention a friend already overseas. Another had received a letter saying a cousin had been killed in North Africa. Another whispered that his older brother hadn't written home in months. Nobody said much after that. The silence spoke for everyone. The war no longer felt like headlines in newspapers. It had names now. Faces. People. As graduation approached, something unexpected happened. The drill sergeant stopped shouting quite so often. Not because they'd become kinder, because they no longer needed to. The men standing in formation weren't the same recruits who had stepped off the train weeks earlier. They moved together, turned together, thought together. Without realizing it, they had become soldiers. On the final inspection, your uniform fit perfectly. Your boots gleamed. Your rifle reflected the morning sun. You stood taller than you had 8 weeks earlier. Not because you'd grown, because responsibility has a way of changing posture. The instructor slowly walked down the line, inspecting every detail. When he reached you, he paused. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, almost quietly, he nodded once and continued walking. It wasn't much, but from him, it felt like the highest compliment imaginable. That evening, your platoon celebrated. Not wildly, just enough to breathe, enough to laugh, enough to forget. For a few precious hours, what waited beyond the gates. Orders would arrive tomorrow. Some men would head to Europe, others to the Pacific. Some would become paratroopers, some infantry, some tankers. None of you knew where you were going. Only that soon, training would end, and history would begin, because everything you'd survived so far, the endless marches, the shouting, the blisters, the exhaustion, had all been designed for one purpose: to prepare you for a place where instructors couldn't protect you anymore, a place where every lesson would finally be tested, and where failure would never come with a second chance. The waiting was finally over. One by one, names were read aloud. No speeches, no dramatic music, just a clipboard, a tired officer, and a list that would quietly decide where thousands of young Americans would spend the most dangerous months of their lives. Europe, Pacific, North Africa. Each destination carried its own version of hell. No one cheered when they heard theirs. Some simply nodded. Others swallowed hard. Because no matter where you were going, the next stop wasn't training. It was war. The days that followed passed in a blur. Equipment was issued with mechanical efficiency. A steel helmet, extra uniforms, mess kits, medical bandages, a gas mask few believed would ever be used, entrenching tools, a backpack so overloaded it seemed impossible anyone could carry it. Then came the rifle, the same rifle you'd cleaned, fired, marched with, and slept beside for weeks. Except now, it wasn't a training weapon anymore. It was your lifeline. The train ride to the port felt different from the one that had brought you to boot camp. Nobody stared curiously out the windows anymore. Nobody talked about girlfriends. Nobody wondered what military life might be like. Now, everyone knew. The excitement had faded. In its place sat something quieter, something heavier. The realization that this journey wasn't leading toward another classroom. It was leading toward men who were actively trying to kill you. When the harbor finally appeared, it stole the breath from almost everyone. The ships seemed impossibly large. Gray steel stretched hundreds of feet into the sky. Cargo cranes swung endlessly overhead. Forklifts darted between stacks of ammunition, food, fuel, and vehicles. The docks never seemed to stop moving. It looked less like a port, and more like an enormous machine feeding an entire war. Thousands of soldiers filled the waterfront, some boarding, some unloading, some saying goodbye. Military police directed traffic with whistles and hand signals. Dock workers shouted over the roar of engines. Somewhere, a military band played patriotic music. It sounded cheerful, almost forced, as though someone believed music alone could make leaving home easier. It couldn't. Families waited behind barriers. Wives held babies who would grow up barely remembering their fathers. Parents searched crowds hoping for one last glimpse. Sweethearts waved handkerchiefs until the soldiers disappeared up the gangplanks. Some cried openly. Others smiled through tears, trying to make the goodbye easier. It never was. Then came the order. Board. The line moved forward. Slowly. Each step carried you farther from everything familiar. The steel gangway clanged beneath hundreds of boots. The smell hit you immediately. Salt water, diesel fuel, fresh paint, hot machinery. The ship felt alive, like some enormous animal waiting patiently to cross the Atlantic. Below deck, reality arrived quickly. Forget the heroic movie scenes. Forget spacious cabins. Forget comfort. Rows upon rows of narrow canvas bunks filled every available inch. Some stacked 5 high, barely enough room to roll over. The air already felt warm, heavy, stale, and the ship hadn't even left port. Several men looked around silently. One muttered, "We're sleeping here." Nobody answered, because the answer was obvious. As evening approached, the ship's horn echoed across the harbor. Deep, powerful, final. Dock lines were released. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the ship began pulling away from the pier. The shoreline drifted backward. The city grew smaller. Families became tiny figures waving from the docks. Some soldiers kept waving long after nobody could possibly recognize them anymore. Maybe they weren't waving at anyone. Maybe they simply weren't ready to lower their hands. The first night at sea surprised almost everyone. Not because of enemy submarines. Not yet. Because of the ocean itself. The ship rolled constantly. Up, down, side to side. Even calm water felt alive beneath your feet. Within hours, seasickness spread through the transport. Strong farm boys who had spent their lives lifting hay bales suddenly couldn't stand upright. Future heroes leaned over railings wishing they had never eaten breakfast. The ocean didn't care how tough you thought you were. It humbled everyone equally. Days settled into routine. Breakfast, equipment inspections, emergency drills, weapons maintenance, long hours waiting. Waiting became its own kind of work. You played cards, read dog-eared books, wrote letters you couldn't mail until reaching land. Some men stared across endless gray water for hours. The Atlantic seemed infinite. No towns, no roads, no landmarks, only waves stretching toward every horizon. Then, the rumors began. Someone claimed a German U-boat had been spotted. Another swore an escort destroyer had dropped depth charges during the night. Nobody knew what was true. Information spread faster than facts aboard a crowded troopship. Every strange noise became suspicious. Every sudden turn of the ship sparked whispers. Sometimes, the convoy changed course without explanation. The officers never said why. They didn't have to. Everyone already knew. Somewhere beneath those dark waters, German submarines were hunting. The lifeboat drills became noticeably more serious after that. Soldiers practiced reaching assigned stations. Life jackets remained close at hand. The instructors explained what to do if the ship was hit, how to abandon ship, how to avoid being pulled beneath the sinking vessel, how long a man could survive in freezing Atlantic water. Nobody joked afterward. The ocean suddenly looked much larger, much colder, much less forgiving. One moonless night, the convoy sailed under complete blackout. Every light aboard the ship disappeared. Even cigarettes were forbidden on deck. A single glowing ember could reveal the convoy's position for miles. The darkness felt unnatural. You couldn't see the ship ahead, couldn't see the ship behind, only the sound of engines, and black water disappearing into black sky. Standing on deck, it felt as though the entire world had vanished. Weeks later, the announcement finally came. Land ahead. Hundreds of soldiers crowded every available railing. At first, you saw almost nothing, just a thin gray line rising from the horizon. Then, slowly, the coastline emerged. Cliffs, buildings, harbor cranes. Europe. For months, it had been a place on maps, a headline in newspapers. Now, it stood directly ahead. Real, solid, waiting. No one cheered. The silence was almost complete, because somewhere beyond those distant hills, millions of men had already died, and before long, you would be joining them, not as a spectator, not as a student, but as a soldier stepping onto a continent, consumed by war. The first thing you noticed wasn't the countryside. It wasn't the accents. It wasn't even the weather. It was the silence. After weeks trapped inside the endless rhythm of a troopship, the solid ground beneath your boots felt almost unreal. For a moment, you simply stood there, breathing. The air smelled different, cooler, damp, like rain had just passed through the fields, leaving behind the scent of wet earth and freshly cut grass. It should have felt comforting. Instead, it reminded you how far from home you really were. The docks buzzed with activity. British soldiers moved with practiced efficiency. Military trucks rumbled across the harbor. Forklifts unloaded mountains of ammunition, fuel, and supplies. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang over a city that had survived years of German bombing. You had seen photographs of the Blitz. Now, you were walking through its aftermath. Buildings stood with entire walls missing. Churches had shattered windows patched with plywood. Black scorch marks still climbed brick walls. People carried on with their daily lives anyway. Children played in the streets. Shopkeepers opened their stores. Women rode bicycles past piles of rubble without slowing down. It was your first lesson about war. People don't stop living because history becomes violent. They simply learn to live. Inside it, the locals greeted the Americans with curious smiles. To many British families, you were a strange combination of guest, ally, and reminder. A reminder that something enormous was coming. Shopkeepers offered directions. Children asked for chewing gum. Young women gathered outside cafes, hoping to meet the Americans they'd heard so much about. For a few brief weeks, the war almost seemed distant. Almost. Training resumed immediately. If anyone believed crossing the Atlantic meant the hard part was over, the Army corrected that misunderstanding within hours. New camps, new instructors, longer marches, harder obstacle courses. This time, everything carried greater urgency. There were no more theoretical lessons. Everything now focused on combat. Because somewhere across the English Channel, German soldiers were preparing too. The officers studied maps constantly. French villages, Normandy beaches, Belgian forests, Dutch canals, Italian mountains. Nobody explained why certain maps appeared more often than others. Nobody had to. Rumors spread through camp like wildfire. Some claimed the invasion would happen within days. Others insisted it wouldn't happen until the following year. Every man believed someone else knew the truth. Almost nobody did. Live-fire exercises became routine, not target practice. Real combat simulations. Machine guns fired overhead, while recruits crawled beneath barbed wire. Explosions erupted only yards away. Smoke swallowed entire fields. The first instinct was always the same. Freeze. The instructors wouldn't allow it. Move. Keep moving. Bullets don't wait. By the end of each exercise, your uniform weighed twice as much, covered in mud, sweat, and exhaustion, exactly as intended. Then came urban combat. Entire mock villages had been built for one purpose: to teach soldiers how quickly cities could become death traps. Every doorway represented danger. Every upstairs window could hide a sniper. Every basement might conceal an enemy. You learn never to walk directly through a doorway. Never silhouette yourself against a window. Never assume a room was empty simply because it looked empty. War rewarded suspicion. Trust could be fatal. Night exercises proved even worse. Darkness erased certainty. Shapes became enemies. Trees became soldiers. Every snapping twig sounded like approaching footsteps. You learned to navigate by whispers, hand signals, tiny flashes of moonlight. Because once real combat began, the night wouldn't protect you. It would hide everyone. One afternoon, your platoon watched a group of veterans arrive from North Africa. They looked different, older, despite some being only a few years older than you. Their uniforms appeared faded by sun and sand. Their faces carried an expression difficult to describe. Not sadness, not fear, something quieter, like men who had already seen too much. The camp grew unusually silent as they walked past. Nobody needed to ask where they'd been. The war had written the answer across their faces. One veteran stopped beside a group of recruits cleaning rifles. He looked down at the polished weapons, then smiled faintly. "You're taking good care of those." Everyone nodded proudly. He paused, then quietly added, "Keep taking care of each other." He didn't explain. He didn't need to. Years later, many recruits remembered those words far more clearly than any speech given by a general. Because rifles win battles. Friends help you survive them. As spring approached, the atmosphere changed again. The number of aircraft filling English skies increased dramatically. Transport planes, bombers, fighters. The roar of engines became almost constant. Convoys packed the roads. Fuel depots overflowed. Harbors filled with landing craft. Something enormous was gathering. Even civilians sensed it. Nobody knew exactly when. Everyone knew it was close. Mail from home became increasingly precious. Your mother's handwriting. Your father's brief updates. Your kid brother complaining that he'd finally beaten your baseball record. Simple things. Ordinary things. They felt like messages from another lifetime. Many soldiers reread the same letters dozens of times. The paper became soft around the edges. The ink slowly faded. The words never lost their power. Then, one evening, the camp commander gathered everyone together. He didn't waste time. No long introduction. No dramatic build-up. Just one sentence. "Gentlemen, your combat orders have arrived." The silence afterwards seemed to swallow the entire camp. Men looked instinctively toward one another. Nobody smiled. Nobody spoke. This wasn't another exercise. This wasn't another training march. Everything that had happened since the draft letter, every blister, every shouted order, every sleepless night, every round fired on the practice range, had all been leading to this moment. Tomorrow, they would begin moving toward the coast. And beyond that coast, waited the beaches, where thousands of young men would discover that no amount of training could fully prepare them. For the first time, someone shoots back. Nobody slept. Some men closed their eyes. Some even snored. But real sleep, the kind that lets your mind forget where you are, never came. Not that night. Because by now, everyone knew. Tomorrow wasn't another exercise. Tomorrow wasn't another march across an English field. Tomorrow, history would begin. The camp had changed. Only yesterday, the roads had been alive with trucks, engineers, and endless supplies moving in every direction. Now, everything had slowed. Orders were whispered instead of shouted. Vehicle headlights remained covered. Even conversations seemed quieter. The closer you came to battle, the less anyone felt like talking. Your rifle rested across your knees. You'd cleaned it 3 times already. There wasn't another speck of dirt anywhere on it. Still, you checked it again. Bolt, safety, magazine, barrel. Not because it needed cleaning. Because your hands needed something to do. Around you, hundreds of other soldiers were doing exactly the same thing. Checking equipment, repacking bags, counting ammunition, adjusting straps that had already been adjusted 10 times before. Nobody admitted it. Everyone was nervous. The officers walked through the camp one last time. Their expressions had changed too. For weeks, they had barked orders, demanded perfection, corrected every mistake. Tonight, they spoke almost gently. One lieutenant stopped beside a young private struggling to tighten his backpack. Without saying a word, he reached down, adjusted the straps, patted him once on the shoulder, and walked away. Sometimes, kindness says more than speeches ever could. The chaplains stayed busy. Some soldiers attended formal services. Others simply wanted someone to talk to. Many hadn't been inside a church in years. Yet suddenly, prayer seemed important again. One man quietly confessed fears he'd never spoken aloud. Another asked the chaplain to write to his parents if he didn't return. Nearby, someone sat completely alone. staring into the darkness, thinking thoughts nobody else could hear. War has a way of making believers and philosophers out of ordinary men. Letters were everywhere. Men wrote by flashlight, by lantern. Some balanced notebooks across their helmets. Others used ammunition crates as desks. The words came slowly. How do you write to someone when you don't know if they'll ever read your next letter? Many started with lies. I'm doing fine. The food's good. Don't worry about me. Small mercies. Tiny attempts to protect the people back home. Then the letters became honest. If anything happens, I just want you to know. I've been thinking about home. Some stopped writing halfway through, folded the paper, started over. Certain thoughts felt impossible to put into words. One soldier quietly handed an envelope to his closest friend. If I don't make it. The friend nodded. No promises. No dramatic handshake. Just a simple understanding between two men who hoped neither would ever need to keep that promise. All across the camp, similar exchanges were happening. Watches, family photographs, wedding rings. Small possessions suddenly carried enormous meaning. The weather became everyone's obsession. Not politics, not strategy. The weather. Strong winds could cancel everything. Heavy seas could drown men before they ever reached shore. Low clouds might hide aircraft, or ground them completely. Every few hours, new forecasts arrived. Officers studied them in silence. No one else knew exactly what they said, but everyone watched the officers' faces, searching for clues. As darkness deepened, the sky above England transformed. Thousands of aircraft engines roared to life. The sound rolled across the countryside like distant thunder. Transport planes, bombers, gliders, fighters, one after another. They disappeared into the night. Some soldiers stood outside watching until the last engine faded into the darkness. Nobody knew whether those crews would return. Farther south, the ports had become almost unrecognizable. The sea seemed covered with ships, landing craft, destroyers, cruisers, battleships, hospital ships, cargo vessels, thousands of them. More ships than many soldiers had seen in their entire lives. Together, they formed the largest invasion fleet ever assembled. The sight was almost impossible to comprehend. An entire army, floating, waiting. Then, the order finally came. Stand by. Conversations stopped immediately. Backpacks were lifted, helmets secured, weapons checked one final time. The waiting was over. Columns of soldiers quietly formed outside the barracks. Nobody spoke above a whisper. Boots crunched softly against gravel. Truck engines idled nearby. One by one, the vehicles pulled away into the darkness. No headlights, no music, no cheers, only the low growl of engines carrying thousands of young men toward the English coast. Hours later, you arrived at the harbor. The invasion fleet stretched farther than your eyes could follow. Ships filled every corner of the water. Their silhouettes disappeared into the darkness. Decks overflowed with vehicles, tanks, jeeps, artillery, endless stacks of ammunition. Everything required to invade a continent. The scale of it left many soldiers speechless. You realized something in that moment. This wasn't just another military operation. This was history's greatest gamble. As you climbed aboard your landing ship, the sea rocked gently beneath your boots. The metal deck vibrated as engines slowly came alive. Around you, thousands of other soldiers found places wherever they could. Some leaned against backpacks. Others quietly smoked one final cigarette. A few pulled photographs from their pockets. One last look, one last reminder of why they had come. Then, the anchors rose. The ships eased away from England. The white cliffs slowly disappeared behind them. Ahead, beyond the black water, lay occupied France. And somewhere beyond those beaches, an enemy that had spent 4 years preparing for this exact moment. By sunrise, the waiting would finally end. And every lesson the army had ever taught you would be tested. Under fire, the sea was calm, too calm. If you'd looked out across the English Channel on that night, you might have thought nothing extraordinary was happening. The moon hung above the water. The waves rolled gently against steel hulls. A cool wind drifted across the decks. It almost felt peaceful. Almost. Because beneath that peaceful surface, more than 150,000 Allied soldiers were crossing toward occupied France. It was the largest amphibious invasion force ever assembled, and every man aboard knew there was no turning back. The convoy stretched beyond the horizon. Wherever you looked, there were ships, destroyers cutting through the darkness, massive battleships, moving with slow, unstoppable confidence, landing ships packed shoulder to shoulder with young men who had never seen combat, cargo vessels carrying mountains of ammunition, hospital ships already waiting for casualties they hadn't yet received. The ocean itself seemed to disappear beneath steel. No one alive had ever witnessed anything like it. No one ever would again. You found a place against the bulkhead. Your backpack rested between your boots. Your rifle leaned across your knees. Around you, dozens of men sat in complete silence. Not because there was nothing to say, because every possible conversation had already been exhausted. The jokes were gone. The nervous laughter had disappeared hours ago. Now, each man was alone with his own thoughts. Someone quietly unfolded a photograph. A young wife smiling on a front porch. A baby who had learned to walk while his father crossed the Atlantic. A family gathered around a Christmas tree months earlier. He stared at it for several minutes, then carefully slipped it back inside his jacket. Not because he was finished looking, because he couldn't bear to look any longer. Another soldier reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded letter, and began reading. For what was probably the 20th time, he already knew every word, every comma, every sentence. Still, he read it again. His mother had written, "Just come home." 3 simple words. So ordinary, so impossible to promise. The engines droned endlessly beneath the deck, a deep mechanical rhythm that never seemed to change. Hours passed. No one knew exactly how many. Time moved strangely at sea. Every minute felt painfully slow. Yet somehow, morning seemed to approach too quickly. Then, without warning, the ship altered course. Not sharply, just enough for everyone to notice. Almost immediately, other vessels did the same. The entire convoy shifted direction with astonishing precision. No whistles, no shouted commands, just thousands of ships, moving together as though connected by invisible strings. The invasion had entered its final approach. Far overhead, the skies suddenly filled with aircraft. At first, you couldn't see them, only hear them. A distant rumble, then another, then hundreds. Transport planes carrying airborne divisions thundered toward Normandy. Inside those aircraft, thousands of paratroopers sat waiting for a green light that would send them jumping into occupied France. Many would land miles from their intended drop zones. Some would never reach the ground alive. Others were already fighting while the invasion fleet was still crossing the channel. The battle had begun, hours before the beaches would ever come into view. Around midnight, the weather changed. The wind picked up. The sea became rougher. Landing craft began rising and crashing against the waves. Men who had recovered from seasickness days earlier suddenly leaned over the rails again. Helmets slid across wet decks. Equipment shifted. The channel reminded everyone that nature could be as dangerous as the enemy. The Navy officers weren't worried about comfort. They worried about timing. Everything depended on timing. Thousands of aircraft, thousands of ships, hundreds of landing craft, naval bombardments, airstrikes, paratroopers, engineers, infantry, armor. Every moving piece had to arrive within minutes of schedule. If one part failed, the entire invasion could unravel. It was less like commanding an army, and more like conducting the largest orchestra in human history. Only every mistake would be measured in lives. Around 3 in the morning, the horizon flickered. At first, it looked like distant lightning. Then someone realized what it was. Bombardment. Battleships had opened fire. The flashes came one after another. Great orange bursts illuminated the darkness. Several seconds later, The thunder reached the convoy. Deep, violent, powerful enough to vibrate through steel decks. Some soldiers instinctively looked toward the coastline. They couldn't see France yet. Only fire. Then the destroyers joined in. Then the cruisers. Hundreds of naval guns fired almost continuously. Each shell weighed more than some of the men aboard the landing craft. The bombardment shook the sea itself. Columns of flame erupted along the distant coast. For a brief moment, many believed nothing could possibly survive such firepower. Veterans knew better. Concrete bunkers had a frightening habit of surviving. Machine guns hidden beneath reinforced steel had survived before. They would survive again. An officer climbed onto a crate near the center of the deck. He spoke loudly, but not dramatically. "Gentlemen, we're almost there." That was all. No speech about glory. No promises of victory. Just the truth. Almost there. The words settled over the ship like a weight. For months, the future had been an idea, a possibility. Now, it was only a few miles away. Slowly, the black horizon began to change. The first faint gray light appeared in the east. Night surrendered inch by inch. Shapes emerged from the darkness. Other ships, landing craft, destroyers. Then, far ahead, a thin strip of land. France. The coastline looked strangely peaceful, quiet, almost beautiful. You could never have guessed that hidden behind those cliffs, inside concrete bunkers, beneath tangled barbed wire, thousands of German soldiers were already awake, watching, waiting, their machine guns loaded, their artillery zeroed in, their orders simple: hold the beaches, or die trying. Within the hour, the ramps would fall, and the young men who had crossed an ocean would step into history, one wave at a time. For months, you had imagined this moment. You pictured charging heroically across an open beach. You imagined shouting, "Victory!" Flags, everything the newsreels promised. Reality arrived differently. It smelled of diesel fuel, vomit, and fear. The closer the landing craft moved toward shore, the rougher the sea became. Each wave slammed the small boat against the next. Steel groaned. Men lost their footing. Some had been seasick for hours. Others had stopped vomiting only because there was nothing left inside them. Nobody cared anymore. The beach was getting closer. That was all anyone could think about. You stood shoulder to shoulder with 30 other soldiers. There wasn't enough room to sit comfortably. Your backpack dug into your shoulders. Your helmet felt heavier than it ever had during training. Your rifle was clutched so tightly your knuckles had turned white. No one looked at each other. Instead, everyone stared at the steel ramp in front of them. That thin sheet of metal separated two completely different worlds. Behind it, you were still alive. Beyond it, nobody knew. The coxswain shouted over the engine. 10 minutes. No one answered. Someone quietly crossed himself. Another reached beneath his jacket and touched a folded photograph. A third whispered something under his breath. Maybe a prayer. Maybe the name of someone waiting back home. No one asked. Some moments belong only to the man living them. Then, the first shells landed. Not on your boat. Nearby, great towers of seawater erupted into the air. Each explosion threw spray high above the landing craft. One blast rocked the boat so violently that several men slammed into one another. Another landed close enough that pieces of metal clattered across the deck. The German artillery had found the invasion fleet. The naval bombardment answered immediately. Battleships several miles offshore unleashed another deafening salvo. The sky flashed orange. A second later, the sound arrived. It wasn't like hearing thunder. It felt like the world itself had cracked open. Shells larger than telephone poles screamed overhead toward the coastline. Some struck bunkers directly. Others vanished behind cliffs in explosions that sent dirt and concrete hundreds of feet into the air. It looked impossible that anyone could survive beneath such fire. Many did. As dawn spread across Normandy, the beaches finally came into view. The first thing you noticed wasn't the sand. It was the obstacles. Hundreds of them. Steel hedgehogs. Wooden stakes tipped with mines. Massive iron barriers planted across the tidal flats. Every one designed for a single purpose: to trap landing craft, to slow infantry, to turn the beach into a killing ground. Months of German engineering stood waiting beneath the morning tide. Then you saw the cliffs. Dark, steep, covered with concrete bunkers that blended almost perfectly into the landscape. At first, they looked abandoned. Then, someone spotted movement. Tiny figures. German soldiers. Watching. Waiting. The coxswain looked toward the shoreline. His face had gone pale. He'd made dozens of practice landings during training. This one would only happen once. He shouted again. 1 minute. Safeties clicked off almost simultaneously. Rifles were checked one final time. Some soldiers tightened the straps on their helmets. Others simply closed their eyes, taking one last breath before everything changed. Then, the machine guns opened fire. It happened so suddenly that for a split second, your brain refused to understand what you were seeing. Thin lines skipped across the water. Little splashes appeared all around the landing craft. Then came the sound, a violent tearing noise unlike anything you'd ever heard. Bullets striking steel. Bullets striking water. Bullets striking men. Training had tried to prepare you. Nothing could. The coxswain screamed. Down. Everyone instinctively crouched. The front of the landing craft rang like a giant bell as bullets slammed into the steel ramp. Metal fragments sprayed through the cramped compartment. Someone cried out. Another man collapsed without making a sound. Nobody could even reach him. There wasn't room. The beach seemed impossibly far away. Yet every second brought the landing craft closer. Machine gun fire intensified. Mortar shells burst among neighboring boats. One landing craft suddenly disappeared behind a column of water and smoke. When the spray settled, it wasn't there anymore. Men floating in the surf marked where it had been. No one had time to stop. The invasion kept moving. Your heart hammered so violently it seemed impossible no one else could hear it. You realized something strange. You weren't thinking about heroism, or medals, or victory. You weren't even thinking about Germany. You were thinking about breathing, about staying alive for one more minute. War has a remarkable way of shrinking the world, until survival becomes the only thing that exists. The boat lurched violently. The engine slowed. A grinding sound echoed beneath your boots. The landing craft had reached the sandbar. The coxswain grabbed the release lever. For one impossible moment, everything became still. The engine idled. The gunfire continued. Every man stared at the steel ramp, waiting, knowing. The coxswain looked back at the soldiers one last time. His voice was almost drowned by the machine guns. Go! The ramp crashed downward, and in an instant, the ocean disappeared behind you. The beach exploded into chaos. Machine guns raked the sand. Mortars churned the shoreline into clouds of smoke and flying debris. Men leaped into water deeper than expected. Some disappeared beneath the weight of their equipment before they ever reached dry land. Others struggled forward through chest-high surf as bullets tore white streaks across the waves around them. Training was over. Every lesson, every march, every sleepless night, every shouted command had led to these first terrifying seconds. Because once your boots touched the sand of Normandy, history no longer cared who you had been. It cared only whether you could survive the next 10 minutes. The water was colder than you expected. Not refreshing. Not invigorating. It stole the air from your lungs the instant you hit it. 1 second, you were standing inside the landing craft. The next, you were waist deep in the English Channel, struggling to stay upright while carrying nearly 70 pounds of equipment. Your boots immediately sank into the sand beneath the water. Your backpack dragged you backward. Your rifle had to stay above the surface. If it filled with seawater, it might become useless. If you dropped it, you might as well keep walking into the sea. Then someone shouted, "Move!" Not because standing still was dangerous, because standing still was deadly. Machine gun fire skimmed across the water so low that it seemed to tear the surface apart. Tiny fountains erupted around you. Hundreds of them. Each splash looked harmless, until the soldier beside you suddenly disappeared beneath the water. No dramatic scream. No final words. One moment he was there. The next, only his helmet floated past. The tide carried it slowly toward shore. Empty. Training had taught you to spread out. The beach made that impossible. Hundreds of men surged toward the same narrow stretch of sand. Some stumbled over underwater obstacles hidden beneath the rising tide. Others became tangled in steel barricades placed there months earlier by German engineers. One landing craft struck a submerged mine. The explosion lifted the entire front of the boat into the air before tearing it apart. Men, weapons, pieces of steel, everything fell back into the water together. Those who survived had to swim through burning fuel while bullets continued cutting across the waves. You reached shallow water. Only a few more yards. The beach looked close enough to touch. Then the artillery found its range. The first shell landed somewhere behind you. The second landed closer. The third, close enough that the explosion threw sand, seawater, and pieces of equipment across your helmet. Your ears began ringing. You opened your mouth to breathe, but all you tasted was salt and smoke. Someone grabbed your shoulder. For one split second, you thought it was a German soldier. Instead, it was another American. His face was covered in wet sand. His helmet was gone. Blood ran from somewhere above his left eye. "What now?" he shouted. You looked toward the cliffs. You looked toward the machine guns. You looked at the open beach between you and them. You realized you had absolutely no idea. Training had never looked like this. The beach itself offered almost no protection. The sand was flat, wide, completely exposed. The tide had trapped hundreds of men in the open. Those who dropped to the ground discovered the bullets still found them. Those who stood up became even easier targets. Instinct screamed, "Run." Logic whispered, "There is nowhere to run." The noise became impossible to separate. Machine guns, mortars, artillery, naval guns firing from offshore, men shouting for medics, officers yelling impossible orders no one could hear, engines roaring, explosions rolling endlessly together until they merged into one continuous sound. You stopped hearing individual gunshots. The battlefield became noise itself. Then you saw something that stayed with survivors for the rest of their lives. A medic. He carried no rifle, only a medical bag marked with a red cross. He sprinted across open sand toward a wounded soldier lying near the surf. Halfway there, he disappeared in an explosion. The wounded soldier never moved again. Neither did the medic. War doesn't stop for courage. Sometimes, it punishes it. A landing craft nearby lowered its ramp. The soldiers inside never had a chance. The German machine gun had already found the exact spot where the ramp would fall. The moment it touched the sand, a stream of bullets poured directly into the crowded compartment. Men fell before they could even step forward. The survivors climbed over them, not because they wanted to, because there was no other way out. Within seconds, the surf carried bodies away from the boat while the next landing craft approached behind it. The invasion could not stop, even if individual lives did. You finally reached the shingle, a narrow ridge of rocks and pebbles just beyond the high tide. It wasn't much, maybe 2 feet high, but after crossing open sand under constant fire, it felt like a fortress. Hundreds of soldiers flattened themselves behind it, panting, shaking, trying desperately to make themselves smaller. Bullets snapped overhead. Every few seconds, someone risked lifting his head. Almost every time, machine gun fire forced him back down. For the first time since leaving England, you had a moment to think. Only a moment. You looked around. The men beside you looked nothing like the confident soldiers who had boarded the ships the night before. Faces streaked with sand, eyes wide with disbelief, hands trembling so violently some struggled to reload their rifles. No one talked about glory anymore. No one talked about victory. Everyone wanted the same thing, to survive another minute. Then another after that. Somewhere farther down the beach, an officer stood up, completely exposed. He pointed toward the cliffs. His voice somehow cut through the chaos. If we stay here, we die here. For a heartbeat. No one moved. The beach had become a trap. The Germans controlled the high ground. The Americans controlled nothing. The only way out was forward, straight toward the machine guns, straight toward the concrete bunkers, straight toward the impossible. And in the next few minutes, ordinary men, terrified beyond anything they had imagined, would begin doing something history would remember for generations. Not because they weren't afraid, but because they found a way to keep moving anyway. The safest place on Omaha Beach was also the deadliest. The narrow strip of shingle where hundreds of American soldiers had thrown themselves offered just enough protection to keep you alive. For now. But everyone understood the terrible truth. If you stayed there, you would eventually die. The Germans weren't running out of ammunition. The tide wasn't going to stop rising. Soon, the sea itself would begin trapping the survivors against the shoreline. The beach had become a cage. You pressed your face into the cold stones. Every few seconds, bullets cracked overhead. Not the dramatic whine from Hollywood movies. Real rifle fire is faster, sharper. It sounds like someone violently ripping canvas inches above your head. The machine guns were worse. They never seemed to pause. Long bursts swept back and forth across the beach with terrifying precision. The Germans weren't firing wildly. They had spent months measuring distances, marking landmarks, preparing kill zones. Every yard of sand had already been memorized. Somewhere to your left, a young lieutenant crawled along the line of exhausted soldiers. His helmet had disappeared hours ago. Blood trickled down one side of his face. He ignored it. As he reached each group, he repeated the same sentence. We have to move. No speeches. No talk of patriotism. Just simple mathematics. Stay here, and the beach becomes your grave. Move, and maybe, just maybe, you have a chance. The problem wasn't courage. It was geography. Above the beach rose steep bluffs, nearly 100 feet high. At the top, German bunkers commanded everything below. Machine guns looked directly onto the shoreline. Mortars dropped shells with horrifying accuracy. Snipers watched every opening. The defenders could see almost everything. The attackers could barely see them at all. It felt less like attacking a position, and more like charging a cliff that had learned how to shoot back. Then, something unexpected happened. Not everywhere, just in small places. Tiny cracks began appearing in the German defense. A handful of engineers reached the beach carrying explosive charges. Ignoring the bullets snapping around them, they crawled toward the steel obstacles blocking the shoreline. One by one, they planted explosives, lit the fuses, ran. Seconds later, massive explosions tore gaps through the obstacles. The beach wasn't safe. But now, landing craft behind them had somewhere to aim. Nearby, a Navy destroyer made an extraordinary decision. Its captain ignored the usual operating distance. Instead, he pushed the ship dangerously close to shore. So close that sailors could clearly see individual German positions through binoculars. It was risky. A single well-placed artillery shell could cripple the ship. The captain accepted the risk. Moments later, the destroyer's guns opened fire. Not at the beach, at the bunkers. One after another, shells smashed directly into the cliffs. Concrete erupted into the air. Machine gun nests that had fired uninterrupted for hours suddenly fell silent. Not all of them, but enough. Sometimes, history changes because one person decides to ignore the rules. An opening appeared, barely visible, a shallow draw cutting through the cliffs. Hidden beneath smoke and debris, a handful of rangers spotted it first. Without waiting for orders, they ran, not together, in small groups. Each man sprinted until the bullets grew too close, then dropped flat, caught his breath, ran again. Every yard felt like a mile. Every second felt borrowed. Some never reached the base of the cliffs. Others did. You saw them moving. At first, it looked impossible. Then, someone beside you stood up. Another followed. Then another. Fear spreads quickly, but courage can spread even faster. Suddenly, small groups of soldiers began leaving the relative safety of the shingle, running toward places that had seemed unreachable only minutes earlier. Nobody believed they were invincible. They simply realized the beach offered no future. The climb was brutal. Loose dirt collapsed beneath your boots. Hands grabbed roots, branches, anything that might help pull you upward. Equipment snagged on bushes. Helmets slipped. Rifles caught on rocks. Above, German soldiers threw grenades down the slopes. The explosions showered climbers with dirt and shattered stone. Still, they kept climbing. Not because it was possible, because stopping was worse. When the first Americans reached the top, the battle changed instantly. The German defenses had been built to fire toward the sea, not behind themselves. Now, small groups of exhausted American infantry began appearing where the defenders least expected them. From gullies, from hedgerows, from the edges of shattered bunkers. The fighting became close, painfully close. No sweeping charges, no dramatic battlefield formations. Just frightened young men encountering equally frightened young men around corners. Inside trenches, behind concrete walls. At that distance, training disappeared. Instinct took over. One machine gun bunker that had terrorized the beach for hours suddenly fell silent. Then another. Then another. Not because naval guns had destroyed them, because infantry had finally reached them. The only way those bunkers could truly be defeated was by soldiers willing to climb straight into them. Back on the beach, the change was almost immediate. The deadly streams of machine gun fire began to weaken. Not everywhere, but enough. More landing craft reached shore. More men crossed the open sand. Medics finally reached wounded soldiers who had lain exposed for hours. The impossible was slowly becoming possible. Foot by bloody foot. By late afternoon, American troops had pushed beyond the beaches. Not far, only a few miles in some places. But they had done the one thing many believed couldn't be done. They had broken through Hitler's Atlantic Wall. The cost had been staggering. Thousands lay dead, wounded, or missing. The beaches behind them remained littered with abandoned equipment, shattered landing craft, and the terrible price of the invasion. Yet despite everything, they had succeeded. As exhausted soldiers looked back toward the sea, they saw something extraordinary. The channel was still filled with ships. Wave after wave of reinforcements continued arriving. The invasion hadn't ended. It had only begun, and somewhere deep inside occupied France. German commanders were only just beginning to understand what had happened. The beaches had held for a while, but now the Allies were ashore, and the road to Berlin had finally opened. The beach was behind you. Barely. You could still hear the naval guns. Still smell the smoke drifting in from the shoreline. Still see columns of black smoke climbing into the Normandy sky. But the battle had changed. The wide-open killing ground of Omaha Beach was gone. Now, the enemy disappeared. And somehow, that made everything even more frightening. The countryside looked almost beautiful. Rolling green fields, stone farmhouses, apple orchards, quiet country roads winding between pastures. If someone had shown you a photograph before the war, you might have thought it was the perfect place to raise a family. Instead, it had become one of the deadliest battlefields in Europe, because Normandy had something the Americans had never trained for. The hedgerows. They weren't ordinary fences. They weren't even ordinary bushes. Over centuries, French farmers had built thick earthen walls around their fields. On top of those walls grew enormous hedges. Some stood 10 feet high. Others were nearly twice that. Their roots twisted deep into the earth. Their branches formed walls so dense that sunlight barely passed through. To a farmer, they marked property lines. To a German soldier, they became natural fortresses. From the road, you couldn't see into the fields. From inside one field, you couldn't see the next. Every hedge blocked your vision. Every corner became an ambush waiting to happen. A machine gun could sit only 20 feet away, and you'd never know until It opened fire. The battlefield had shrunk. Not to miles. Not to yards. Sometimes to inches. The Germans understood the terrain perfectly. Many had spent weeks reinforcing the hedgerows, digging hidden firing positions, connecting fields with narrow trenches, camouflaging machine gun nests beneath leaves and branches. They could move almost invisibly. The Americans had to cross open gaps between fields. Every crossing felt like walking into a doorway, without knowing who stood on the other side. The first patrol entered cautiously, rifles raised, eyes scanning every branch, every shadow, every movement. Nothing, only birds, wind, leaves rustling gently overhead. One soldier relaxed slightly. Then, the hedge exploded. Machine gun fire erupted from somewhere inside the greenery. The sound echoed through the narrow lane. Several men dove instinctively into roadside ditches. Others fired back. The problem was, they couldn't see what they were shooting at. The Germans could see them. They couldn't see the Germans. Within seconds, the peaceful French countryside had transformed into chaos. Bullets snapped through branches. Leaves rained onto the road. Tree trunks splintered under rifle fire. Grenades disappeared into the hedges, followed by muffled explosions that often revealed nothing. Silence would return. Then, without warning, another machine gun somewhere else would open fire. The enemy seemed to be everywhere and nowhere. Veterans quickly learned a terrifying truth. Never be the first man through a hedgerow. The Germans knew exactly where Americans would climb, exactly where they would crawl. The openings became kill zones. Some soldiers tried climbing over. They became perfect silhouettes against the sky. Others crawled underneath. Sometimes they crawled directly into waiting rifle barrels. There was no safe method, only less dangerous ones. The tanks faced their own nightmare. On open ground, American Shermans relied on speed and mobility. Inside the hedgerows, they became trapped. The earthen banks were too steep to climb. The narrow roads restricted movement. German anti-tank guns waited patiently behind concealed positions. A tank might spend several minutes trying to cross a single hedge. Several minutes was an eternity. One afternoon, a Sherman eased toward a hedgerow. The crew couldn't see beyond it. The infantry couldn't either. The tank commander slowly raised himself through the hatch, trying to get a better view. At that exact moment, a German anti-tank gun fired. The shell struck the front armor with a deafening crash. Smoke poured from the engine compartment. The crew scrambled out through the hatches. Some escaped. Some didn't. The tank remained there for days. A silent reminder of how quickly confidence could disappear. The Americans adapted. They always did. Engineers welded crude steel prongs onto the front of Sherman tanks. They called them rhino tanks. Instead of climbing over hedgerows, the sharpened steel ripped straight through them. The massive roots that had protected German defenses for centuries suddenly became obstacles that could be torn apart. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't planned before the invasion. It was born from necessity. War has always rewarded those who learn faster. The infantry adapted too. Small patrols replaced large formations. Soldiers stopped advancing down the center of roads. They moved through orchards, along ditches, through narrow gaps hidden beneath vegetation. Communication became quieter. Hand signals replaced shouted commands. Sometimes, entire firefights occurred at distances so short that soldiers could hear each other breathing. Then came the rain. Heavy, cold, relentless. The roads dissolved into mud. Vehicles became trapped. Boots weighed twice as much after every step. Foxholes filled with water overnight. Uniforms never truly dried. You learned what every infantryman eventually learns. Being cold doesn't hurt immediately. It simply never stops. Days blended together. Field after field. Hedge after hedge. Ambush after ambush. Victories were measured not by miles, but by fences. One field captured, then another after that. Sometimes, an entire day of brutal fighting advanced the front less than half a mile. The newspapers back home showed arrows sweeping dramatically across maps. The soldiers knew the truth. Every inch of those arrows had been paid for. One evening, after another exhausting day, your platoon stopped beside a ruined farmhouse. Nobody spoke much. Someone quietly passed around a canteen. Another shared the last of his cigarettes. The sun slowly disappeared behind the hedgerows. Birds began singing again. It felt almost impossible. Only hours earlier, the same fields had echoed with machine guns and artillery. Now, nature behaved as though nothing had happened. War, you realized, doesn't change the world. It only changes the people forced to live through it. And somewhere beyond those endless hedgerows, another town waited. Another German defensive line. Another battle. Because surviving D-Day hadn't brought you closer to going home. It had only earned you the chance to keep fighting. The first snow looked beautiful. For about 5 minutes, soft white flakes drifted across the trees. Fields disappeared beneath a blanket of fresh powder. The ruined villages seemed strangely peaceful, almost untouched, if you ignored the shattered church towers, the burned farmhouses, and the abandoned tanks half buried beneath the snow. You could almost pretend the war had paused. It hadn't. Winter simply gave it a different face. The cold arrived slowly, then all at once. At first, you noticed it only in the mornings. Breath hanging in the air, frozen puddles crunching beneath your boots, the metal of your rifle biting against bare skin. Then the temperature kept falling. Every day, a little lower. Every night, a little crueler. Until eventually, the cold became another enemy. One that never stopped attacking. The army had prepared you for bullets. It had prepared you for artillery. It had prepared you for hunger. No one had truly prepared you for living inside freezing temperatures for weeks at a time. Your boots never completely dried. Your socks stayed damp. Your gloves froze stiff overnight. Every morning, the simple act of putting on your uniform felt like climbing into a block of ice. Foxholes became frozen graves. You dug them through soil so hard it felt like concrete. Some men spent hours hacking at the ground with entrenching tools that barely left scratches. Others discovered frozen corpses beneath the surface. Soldiers who had fallen weeks earlier and become part of the earth itself. Nobody talked about it. They simply dug somewhere else. Sleep became almost impossible. The ground pulled warmth from your body all night long. You wrapped yourself in every blanket you owned. It wasn't enough. Your teeth chattered until your jaw hurt. Sometimes, you woke up because your hands had gone numb. Other times, because artillery had started again. Eventually, you couldn't remember which was worse, the shelling or the silence between it. Food froze. Coffee froze. Water froze. Everything froze. You learned to keep your canteen inside your jacket. Not because it kept the water warm, because otherwise, there wouldn't be any water at all. A loaf of bread became so hard you needed a bayonet just to cut it. Butter had to be chipped apart with a knife. Even cigarettes became brittle enough to snap in half. The war demanded constant adaptation. Winter demanded even more. The medics feared something almost as much as enemy fire. Frostbite. It began quietly. A numb fingertip. A pale toe. A patch of skin that no longer seemed to belong to your body. The danger wasn't the pain. It was the absence of pain. Once feeling disappeared, damage had already begun. Medics walked the lines every day reminding soldiers to check one another's ears, fingers, feet, faces. Sometimes your life depended on another man noticing what you couldn't feel. Then came the snowstorms. Visibility dropped to only a few yards. Entire patrols disappeared into white silence. Vehicles slid into ditches. Road signs vanished beneath drifts. Compass bearings became more valuable than maps. The landscape itself had changed. Fields, roads, ditches. Everything looked exactly the same. White. Endless white. The Germans suffered too. Cold doesn't choose sides. It froze American rifles. It froze German rifles. It buried American foxholes. It buried German bunkers. Both armies fought the same weather. The difference was, One side often held higher ground, and in winter, high ground mattered even more. One afternoon, your platoon reached an abandoned farmhouse. The roof had collapsed months earlier. Most of the windows were gone, but one room still had four walls. For the first time in weeks, you found shelter from the wind. Someone discovered an old stove. Another found broken furniture. Within minutes, chairs, cupboards, even shattered doors disappeared into the fire. Nobody cared about preserving the house anymore. Warmth had become more valuable than history. As the flames grew stronger, something extraordinary happened. Men smiled, not because the war had improved, because they could finally feel their fingers again. Someone heated coffee. Someone else warmed canned rations. For half an hour, the room filled with steam instead of gun smoke. Conversation returned. Laughter even appeared. Small, quiet, almost embarrassed laughter. It's astonishing how little comfort human beings truly need. A hot drink, dry socks, a fire. Sometimes, that was enough to remind you why survival mattered. That evening, snow continued falling outside. You stepped through the broken doorway. The battlefield had vanished beneath fresh white powder. The shell craters looked softer somehow. The burned trees stood frozen beneath layers of ice. For a brief moment, it looked almost beautiful. Then, far across the valley, an artillery shell exploded. The snow leapt into the air. The illusion disappeared. War had simply hidden beneath winter's blanket, waiting patiently for the next thaw. And before that thaw arrived, another battle was coming, one so brutal that the men who survived it would spend the rest of their lives measuring every other hardship against those freezing days. It would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. By December 1944, most American soldiers believed the worst was behind them. France had been liberated. Paris was free. German forces had retreated across much of Western Europe. The newspapers back home talked about victory as though it were only weeks away. Even many officers quietly believed it. The war was ending, or so it seemed. Then, the Ardennes exploded. The Ardennes forest had always felt different. Dense, ancient, almost unnaturally quiet. Towering pine trees blocked much of the winter sunlight. Snow muffled every footstep. Roads twisted through valleys where visibility vanished after only a few hundred yards. It was beautiful, and that beauty concealed one final German gamble. Before dawn on December 16th, the silence shattered. Thousands of German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously. The earth shook. The sky turned orange. Telephone lines disappeared beneath explosions. Entire American headquarters vanished before anyone understood what was happening. Men woke believing they were under routine shelling. Within minutes, they realized something far worse had begun. Germany wasn't retreating. Germany was attacking. For months, Hitler had secretly gathered nearly every reserve he could still find. Elite panzer divisions, veteran infantry, the last fuel, the last ammunition, the last hope. If this offensive succeeded, the German army might split the Allied front, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force Britain and America into negotiating peace. It was an impossible plan, but impossible plans have one advantage. No one expects them. The first reports made almost no sense. Entire units had disappeared. Roads thought to be secure were suddenly occupied by German tanks. Columns of refugees clogged highways alongside retreating American trucks. Some headquarters believed the reports were exaggerated. Others assumed the attacks were only local counterattacks. By the time the truth became clear, German armor had already punched deep into Allied lines. The front wasn't bending. It was breaking. Then came the fog. Heavy, thick, relentless. Aircraft couldn't fly. Bombers stayed grounded. Fighters remained on their airfields. For the first time in months, the Allies lost the advantage that had dominated the skies over Europe. Now, the battle belonged entirely to the men on the ground, and to the tanks hidden somewhere inside the forest. Your platoon received orders just before sunrise. Pack everything. Move immediately. No explanation. Only urgency. The trucks raced toward the sound of distant artillery. Nobody knew exactly where they were going, only that somewhere ahead, American soldiers desperately needed help. The closer you came, the stranger everything looked. Burned vehicles lined frozen roads. Military police waved traffic in impossible directions. Ambulances raced past carrying men wrapped in blood-stained blankets. Engineers struggled to clear wrecked trucks from narrow mountain roads. Everywhere, there was movement, controlled, but frantic. It looked like an army trying desperately to hold itself together. Then, you saw the first prisoners. American soldiers, hands wrapped in blankets, faces pale from exhaustion. Some hadn't eaten properly in days. Others stared silently into the distance. A medic handed one man a cup of coffee. He held it for several seconds before realizing he was shaking too badly to drink. No one asked what he'd seen. His eyes already answered the question. The cold somehow felt even worse inside the Ardennes. Snow covered everything. Roads disappeared beneath ice. Every breath burned your lungs. Your rifle's metal froze against your gloves. Oil thickened inside weapon mechanisms. Machine guns jammed. Truck engines refused to start. The weather wasn't simply uncomfortable anymore. It had become another battlefield. Then came the rumors. German commandos wearing American uniforms. Captured jeeps driving behind Allied lines. Road signs secretly changed to send convoys in the wrong direction. At first, it sounded ridiculous. Then military police began stopping everyone. What's the capital of Illinois? Who won the World Series? What is Mickey Mouse's girlfriend's name? Questions that sounded absurd, until you understood why. The Germans had actually infiltrated behind Allied lines disguised as Americans. Even your own uniform no longer guaranteed trust. Late one afternoon, your platoon reached a crossroads deep inside the forest. The trees stood perfectly still. Snow drifted gently across abandoned foxholes. It looked peaceful, almost untouched. Then someone noticed fresh tank tracks. Wide, deep, heading directly toward your position. The lieutenant knelt beside them. He didn't need to say anything. Everyone recognized the pattern. Panthers. German Panthers. And they weren't old tracks. They had been made only hours earlier. The order spread quietly down the line. Dig in. No speeches. No dramatic commands. Just 3 simple words. Every entrenching tool immediately struck frozen ground. The problem was that frozen ground doesn't dig easily. Every swing sent painful vibrations through your arms. The earth had frozen as hard as concrete. Foxholes that normally took 20 minutes now required hours. Hours you probably didn't have. As darkness settled over the forest, the artillery began again. The shells arrived without warning. Tree trunks exploded into clouds of splintered wood. Snow erupted into the air. Branches rained down like shattered glass. The forest itself seemed to be coming apart. Somewhere beyond those trees, German infantry were already advancing, moving silently through the snow, closing the distance one careful step at a time. Tomorrow, the Battle of the Bulge would demand everything you had left. And for many men, everything would not be enough. If there was one word that came to define the Battle of the Bulge, it was Bastogne, a small Belgian town. Quiet, ordinary, the kind of place you could drive through in 5 minutes and never think about again. But in December 1944, the entire Western Front seemed to revolve around it. Because whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the roads, and whoever controlled the roads controlled the battle. The Germans knew it. The Americans knew it. That meant one thing. Neither side could afford to lose it. The 101st Airborne Division arrived exhausted. Many had been pulled from rear areas with almost no warning. Some climbed into trucks believing they were headed for another quiet assignment. Instead, they found themselves racing toward one of the largest German offensives of the war. There wasn't enough winter clothing, not enough ammunition, not enough food. Some soldiers reached Bastogne without proper gloves, others without overshoes. A few carried little more than the rifle in their hands. There wasn't time to wait. The Germans were already coming. Snow continued falling. The roads disappeared beneath ice. Visibility shrank with every passing hour. The forests surrounding Bastogne became silent. Not peaceful. Waiting. Every tree concealed another possibility. Every shadow suggested movement. The Germans were out there. Nobody knew exactly where. Only that they were getting closer. The defensive line formed quickly. Foxholes. Machine gun nests. Anti-tank positions. Anything the men could build before the attack arrived. Frozen ground. Turned every shovel into a hammer. Each swing echoed painfully through cold hands already losing feeling. Some foxholes never reached full depth. There simply wasn't enough time. The enemy wasn't going to wait for the ground to thaw. Then, they came. Not with a dramatic charge. Not with bugles or battle cries. The first sign was artillery. Thousands of shells crashing into the American perimeter. The forest exploded. Trees shattered. Snow blasted into enormous white clouds. Wood splinters flew through the air faster than bullets. Veterans feared something called tree bursts more than direct hits. A shell exploding high above the ground showered deadly wooden splinters in every direction. The forest itself became a weapon. When the shelling finally stopped, the silence lasted only seconds. Then, the machine guns began. German infantry emerged from the snow-covered woods, gray uniforms blending almost perfectly into the winter landscape. Behind them, Panzer tanks advanced carefully between the trees. Their engines growled beneath the constant crack of rifle fire. The battle had begun. The cold made everything harder. Reloading, aiming, digging, even speaking. Fingers became numb within minutes. Triggers felt strangely distant beneath thick gloves. Some soldiers removed the gloves for better control. Within moments, their hands turned white from the freezing air. Every decision carried consequences. Protect your hands, or shoot more accurately. Neither choice felt right. Food became almost impossible to deliver. Supply trucks struggled through snow-covered roads under constant artillery fire. Some never arrived. Others reached the lines carrying only a fraction of what had been loaded. Rations were cut. Coffee became precious. A single hot meal felt like a luxury from another lifetime. Nobody complained. There wasn't enough energy. Then the ammunition began running low. Every bullet mattered. Machine gun crews counted belts carefully. Riflemen stopped firing. At distant targets, you waited. Let the Germans come closer. Closer. Only then did you squeeze the trigger. Not because you wanted to, because you had to. There might not be another magazine after this one. The wounded faced another nightmare. Medical stations overflowed. Doctors worked nonstop. Morphine supplies dwindled. Bandages froze solid. Ambulances struggled to reach the front through snow and shellfire. Many wounded soldiers waited hours before treatment. Not because nobody cared, because nobody could reach them. Then, the Germans sent a message. It arrived beneath a white flag. An officer stepped forward carrying a formal demand. The Americans were surrounded. Resistance was hopeless. Further fighting would only create unnecessary bloodshed. The German commander politely requested the American surrender. The note was delivered to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. He read it once, looked at the officers around him, thought for a moment, then wrote a single word. Nuts. That was the entire reply. One word. No explanation. No negotiation. Just nuts. The Germans reportedly stared at the message in confusion. One American officer finally explained. It means, go to hell. The note spread through Bastogne almost immediately. For exhausted American soldiers freezing in muddy foxholes, it became something more than a joke. It became proof. Proof that someone still believed they could hold. Sometimes, hope arrives in the smallest possible package. One word. Still, hope alone couldn't stop tanks, or artillery, or hunger. The attacks continued day after day. The perimeter shrank, then stabilized, then shrank again. Every morning, someone discovered another empty foxhole. Another friend who wouldn't answer roll call. Another blanket covering another body waiting to be buried after the battle. War had become painfully personal. Names disappeared faster than replacements arrived. Then, after days trapped beneath endless clouds, the weather changed. The gray sky finally broke apart. Sunlight spilled across the snow. To civilians, it would have looked beautiful. To the men inside Bastogne, it looked like salvation. Because clear skies meant one thing. The aircraft were coming. Soon, the deep rumble of transport planes filled the frozen air. Parachutes blossomed overhead. Hundreds of them. White canopies drifting gently across the battlefield. Inside the containers, ammunition, medical supplies, food, winter clothing, everything the defenders had been running out of. Some parachutes landed inside American lines. Some drifted into German positions. War remained unpredictable until the very end. But enough reached Bastogne. Enough to keep the defenders alive. Enough to keep them fighting. Enough to make sure the town would never fall. The German offensive had reached its breaking point. And with it, Hitler's last great gamble in the West had begun to collapse. By January 1945, the snow was still there. The cold was still there. The dead were still there. But something had changed. The German offensive had failed. Hitler had thrown the last great reserve of his army into the Ardennes and lost it. Thousands of irreplaceable tanks were gone. Thousands of experienced soldiers were gone. Thousands of officers who could never be replaced were gone. The Battle of the Bulge hadn't ended the war, but it had ended Germany's last realistic chance of changing it. The Americans didn't celebrate. There wasn't much left to celebrate. Entire companies had disappeared. Veteran sergeants who had survived North Africa, Sicily, and Normandy now lay beneath frozen Belgian fields. Replacement soldiers kept arriving. Young faces, clean uniforms, eyes that still carried curiosity. The veterans recognized that look immediately. They remembered having it once. It never lasted long. The advance east resumed. Slowly at first, then faster. Each town looked strangely familiar. A church with its roof missing. Burned. Trucks abandoned beside the road. Telephone poles leaning at impossible angles. Families hiding inside cellars. War had begun, leaving the same scars everywhere. Different countries. Different languages. The destruction always looked the same. Crossing into Germany felt different. Nobody needed to announce it. Everyone simply knew. The road signs had changed. The architecture had changed. Even the farms looked different. For years, Germany had been an idea, a place discussed in newspapers, a country somewhere beyond maps and oceans. Now, you were standing inside it. The war had come full circle. Some soldiers expected fanatics behind every window. Others expected civilians to attack them. Instead, many towns were eerily quiet. Old men stood silently outside damaged homes. Women swept broken glass from sidewalks. Children peeked cautiously through shattered windows. Most looked exhausted. Not angry. Just tired. The war had consumed them too. That realization surprised many Americans. It wasn't sympathy. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something more complicated. The enemy wasn't only the soldiers firing rifles. There were ordinary people here. Families, children, grandparents. Many had lost sons. Many had lost homes. Many had lost everything. War rarely limits its suffering to those carrying weapons. Then came the refugees. Endless columns of civilians moving west. Horse-drawn wagons piled high with blankets. Mothers carrying infants wrapped in heavy coats. Old men pushing bicycles loaded with everything they still owned. Some walked for days, others for weeks. Nobody knew exactly where they were going, only that they had to keep moving. Behind them, the Soviet army was advancing relentlessly. Fear moved faster than any tank. The roads became clogged. Military convoys struggled to pass civilians. Ambulances fought through traffic. Supply trucks crawled forward mile by mile. Sometimes, entire divisions waited because frightened families had nowhere else to go. The war had become too large for anyone to control. Millions of lives were moving in every direction at once. Your platoon reached a small German village late one afternoon. There had been fighting there only hours earlier. Bullet holes covered stone walls. Smoke drifted from a collapsed barn. A Sherman tank stood abandoned beside the church. Its crew had already moved on, or been carried away. No one asked which. Inside one house, an elderly woman quietly offered coffee. Real coffee, not army rations, not powdered substitutes. She spoke no English. The soldiers spoke almost no German. Yet somehow, for several minutes, nobody needed words. She poured cups. The Americans nodded politely. She nodded back. Outside, the artillery continued rumbling somewhere beyond the hills. Inside, ordinary people shared ordinary kindness. History rarely remembers moments like these. The men who experienced them never forgot. As the advance continued, rumors began spreading through the ranks. Strange rumors. Entire prison camps discovered. Starving prisoners. Mass graves. Nobody knew whether the stories were true. Many assumed they had been exaggerated. War produced rumors every day. Most turned out to be false. These didn't. One afternoon, your company received orders to secure what intelligence described only as a detention facility. The words sounded clinical, almost harmless. Nobody expected what waited beyond the gates. The smell reached the soldiers first, long before they saw the camp. A sickly odor drifting through the trees. Impossible to identify. Impossible to ignore. The closer they marched, the stronger it became. Some men instinctively covered their noses. Others simply looked at one another. Nobody spoke. The gates finally came into view. Barbed wire stretched toward the horizon. Guard towers stood above the fences. The place looked strangely quiet, almost abandoned. The German guards had already fled. What remained behind would change many soldiers forever, because nothing, not boot camp, not Normandy, not the hedgerows, not Bastogne, had prepared them for what they were about to see. The battlefield had shown them how people died. The camps would show them how people had been forced to live. And for many American soldiers, that discovery became the moment they understood exactly what this war had truly been about. Nothing moved. Not at first. The gates stood open. The guard towers were empty. The silence felt unnatural. After months of artillery, machine guns, and tank engines, this place should have sounded peaceful. Instead, it felt abandoned, as though life itself had quietly stepped away. The smell grew stronger with every step. No one could quite describe it. Smoke, decay, disease, something else. Something no soldier had ever encountered before. Several men instinctively covered their noses. Others said nothing. They simply kept walking. The camp stretched farther than anyone expected. Rows of wooden barracks disappeared into the distance. Barbed wire surrounded everything. Watchtowers overlooked every corner. The place had been built with terrifying efficiency, not to house people, to control them. Every fence, every gate, every building, designed with one purpose. No one left without permission. Then, someone appeared. A man, at least. You assumed it was a man. He wore striped clothing that hung loosely from his body. His face seemed impossibly thin. His cheeks had collapsed inward. His eyes looked far older than the rest of him. For several seconds, he simply stared, not speaking, not moving, almost as though he wasn't certain you were real. Another figure emerged, then another, then dozens. Slowly, people began stepping from the barracks. Many walked with difficulty. Some leaned on one another for support. Others crawled. Several were too weak to stand at all. The soldiers stopped where they were. Nobody had prepared them for this. Back home, Americans had heard rumors. Newspapers occasionally mentioned prison camps. Radio broadcasts hinted at atrocities. Most people imagined harsh prisons, forced labor, terrible conditions. What stood before these soldiers was something entirely different. This wasn't imprisonment. It was systematic starvation. The prisoners looked almost unreal. Uniforms hung from bodies that had lost nearly all muscle. Arms looked no thicker than broom handles. Collarbones pushed sharply against skin. Some faces carried expressions so empty they seemed almost beyond emotion. Others smiled weakly, not because they felt joy, because they had survived long enough to see someone open the gates. One American private quietly reached into his backpack. He pulled out a chocolate bar. Without thinking, he handed it to the nearest prisoner. The man grabbed it desperately. Another soldier stopped him. Not so fast. The medics arrived almost immediately. They understood something the infantry did not. People who had been starving for months couldn't suddenly eat large meals. Their bodies might not survive it. Even kindness had to be measured carefully. Inside the barracks, the reality became even harder to comprehend. Wooden bunks stacked 3 levels high. Thin blankets. Almost no heating. Almost no sanitation. The air felt heavy. Stale. Every surface seemed covered in dust. And sickness. Many prisoners were too weak even to stand when the Americans entered. They simply watched from their bunks. Too exhausted to celebrate. Too exhausted to cry. One medic later admitted. He had treated men on Omaha Beach. He had worked through Bastogne. He had seen friends torn apart by artillery. Nothing, he said, prepared him for the camps. Because battle kills quickly. This had taken months, sometimes years. Every prisoner represented suffering stretched across unimaginable lengths of time. The doctors immediately organized emergency treatment. Water first, small amounts, carefully. Then, broth, medicine, blankets. Field hospitals sprang into action almost instantly. Nobody cared about rank anymore. Infantrymen carried stretchers. Tank crews unloaded medical supplies. Engineers repaired broken water systems. Every available pair of hands found something useful to do. Then came the records. Stacks of paperwork. Lists of names. Transport schedules. Prison numbers. Storage rooms filled with confiscated belongings. Suitcases carefully labeled with family names. Children's shoes. Eyeglasses. Wedding rings. Hairbrushes. Thousands of ordinary possessions. Each one belonging to someone who had once expected to reclaim it. Many never would. The soldiers wandered through those rooms in stunned silence. There were no speeches, no orders, just quiet disbelief. One man picked up a child's shoe, turned it over slowly, set it back exactly where he'd found it. Another stared at shelves filled with spectacles. Hundreds, perhaps thousands. He whispered only one sentence. How many people? Nobody answered. Because nobody knew. Not yet. Word spread rapidly through the Allied armies. Journalists arrived. Military photographers documented everything. Commanders insisted the evidence be preserved. Not for propaganda. For history. They understood something immediately. One day, people might refuse to believe what had happened here. The photographs would become witnesses. The soldiers themselves would become witnesses. Many American veterans later said this was the moment the war finally made complete sense. Not Normandy, not the Bulge, not crossing the Rhine. The camps. For months, they had fought because they were ordered to, because their country had been attacked, because Hitler had to be defeated. Standing inside those fences, they finally saw what defeat would actually prevent. The mission became personal, not revenge, responsibility. That evening, your platoon left the camp in complete silence. Nobody joked. Nobody complained about the weather. Nobody argued about rations. The road ahead remained dangerous. German soldiers were still fighting. The war wasn't over. But something inside nearly every man had changed. The enemy was no longer an abstract army defending territory. The enemy had built places like this. Places that should never have existed. And for the first time since boarding the train back home, every exhausted soldier understood exactly why he had crossed an ocean, and why the fighting had to continue until the very end. By March 1945, Germany was collapsing, not all at once, not dramatically. It was happening the way great empires often fall, piece by piece, town by town, bridge by bridge. The armies that had once marched triumphantly across Europe were now fighting desperately just to slow the inevitable. Everyone could feel it, even the Germans. The question was no longer if the war would end. The question was, how many more people would die before it did? Ahead lay the Rhine. For centuries, that river had been more than water. It was Germany's shield, its frontier, its final natural defense against armies advancing from the west. Napoleon had crossed it. The Romans had feared it. Now, the Allied armies stood on its western bank, looking across at the heart of Germany itself. The current moved slowly, calmly, as though history had nothing to do with it. The river didn't care about politics, or borders, or empires. It had watched armies come and go for nearly 2,000 years. Soon, it would watch another. German engineers had spent weeks destroying bridges behind them. Massive explosions sent centuries-old stone arches crashing into the water. Steel bridges folded into twisted skeletons. Railway crossings vanished beneath clouds of smoke. The message was clear. If the Allies wanted Germany, they would have to build their own way across. Then, something extraordinary happened. On March 7th, American troops reached the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. The Germans had planned to destroy it. The explosives had already been placed. The detonator was triggered. The bridge exploded, but it didn't fall. The smoke cleared. Against every expectation, the bridge was still standing. Damaged, burning, but standing. For a few precious moments, history paused. American officers stared across the river in disbelief. The Germans stared back with equal disbelief. Neither side could quite believe what they were seeing. One of the most important bridges in Europe had survived. Barely. Then someone shouted, "Go!" The hesitation vanished instantly. American infantry sprinted toward the bridge. Not cautiously, not methodically, running. The Germans opened fire immediately. Machine guns hammered the steel framework. Mortar rounds burst overhead. Chunks of concrete crashed into the river below. Still, the soldiers kept running. The bridge shook beneath every explosion. Sections of the wooden roadway had already been blown apart. Steel cables groaned overhead. Nobody knew whether the entire structure might collapse at any second. Every man crossing understood the risk, but they also understood something else. If they stopped, the opportunity would disappear forever. The first soldiers reached the eastern bank. Then more. Then entire companies. Engineers followed close behind, working under constant shell fire. They searched desperately for unexploded demolition charges. Several were still hidden beneath the bridge. If they detonated, everyone on the structure would die. Working with shaking hands, the engineers cut wires, removed explosives, threw them into the river. One mistake would have ended everything. There wasn't one. By nightfall, thousands of American troops had crossed. The impossible had become reality. Germany's greatest natural barrier had been breached. The bridge would eventually collapse days later from accumulated damage. But by then, it no longer mattered. The foothold had already been secured. Nothing could reverse it. Elsewhere, engineers built pontoon bridges around the clock. Floating roadways stretched across the Rhine like ribbons of steel. Tank after tank rolled over them. Truck after truck. Convoy after convoy. The river that had once protected Germany now carried the invasion deeper into its heart. The western defenses had been broken. Completely. Resistance continued. But it felt different now. German units fought hard in places, collapsed in others. Some officers still obeyed every order. Others quietly surrendered. Many ordinary soldiers no longer believed victory was possible. They fought because retreat meant execution. Surrender meant uncertainty. War had become a series of impossible choices. Then came something few American soldiers expected. German civilians. Not cheering, not protesting, simply watching. Old women stood silently in doorways. Children peeked nervously through broken windows. Some men cautiously stepped forward carrying white cloths. Others remained hidden. Years of propaganda had warned them that Allied soldiers would destroy everything. Instead, They watched tired young Americans walking cautiously through ruined streets, looking just as exhausted as everyone else. The cities became larger. Cologne, Koblenz, Frankfurt. Many had been shattered by bombing. Entire neighborhoods stood empty. Church spires rose above seas of rubble. Smoke still drifted from buildings destroyed days earlier. Sometimes, the destruction felt almost endless. One soldier later admitted, "There were moments when it felt like the whole country had become one giant ruin." At night, you climbed onto the roof of a damaged building overlooking the Rhine. The river reflected the moonlight quietly below. Bridges floated across it. Convoys moved steadily east. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the Soviet army was advancing from the opposite direction. Two enormous armies, closing toward one another. Between them, the Third Reich was being crushed. You realized something then. The war wasn't winding down. It was accelerating. Everything was happening faster now. The front lines, the surrendering towns, the retreating Germans. History itself seemed to be speeding toward its conclusion. And somewhere ahead, beyond the rivers, beyond the ruined cities, beyond the smoke, lay Berlin, the city where the war in Europe would finally end, and where millions of lives would be forever changed. By April 1945, the map hardly mattered anymore. For years, officers had gathered around tables covered with colored pins, arrows, and handwritten notes. Every village captured, every bridge destroyed, every mile earned through blood. Now, the front lines were moving so quickly that yesterday's maps were already obsolete. Germany wasn't retreating anymore. It was unraveling. The roads east were crowded with surrendering soldiers. Not small groups. Entire columns. Young boys barely old enough to shave. Gray-haired veterans who had survived 2 wars. Officers walking beside privates. The rank on their collars no longer mattered. Everyone carried the same expression. Exhaustion. Some still held their rifles. Others had thrown them into ditches miles earlier. No one wanted to fight anymore. They simply wanted to survive long enough to go home. For the American infantry, the advance felt strangely empty. Many villages surrendered before the first shot was fired. White sheets hung from windows. Church bells remained silent. Town mayors walked into the streets carrying improvised white flags. No speeches, no negotiations, just quiet acceptance. The war had reached its inevitable conclusion. Yet danger remained. Every crossroads still demanded caution. Every abandoned farmhouse might conceal a sniper. Every stretch of forest could hide soldiers who had never received the order to surrender. The closer victory came, the more dangerous complacency became. Many men died in those final weeks. Not during great offensives, during routine patrols, random artillery fire. One last bullet fired by someone who refused to believe the war was ending. It was a cruel irony. To survive Normandy, the hedgerows, the Bulge, only to fall days before peace. Then came the news. Not through newspapers, not over the radio, through whispers. Hitler was dead. At first, almost no one believed it. Rumors had followed the war from the beginning. Hitler captured, Hitler wounded, Hitler fleeing to the Alps. Every week seemed to produce another impossible story. This one sounded no different. Until more reports arrived. Then more. Eventually, the whispers became certainty. The man whose face had stared from every poster, every newspaper, every intelligence briefing, was gone. The fighting didn't stop immediately. It couldn't. Armies don't simply pause because one man dies. Orders still had to travel. Generals still had to surrender. Entire formations remained cut off from communication. In many places, the shooting continued. But something had changed. The determination was gone. Even the Germans seemed to understand. The end had finally arrived. Then, on May 7th, word spread through the camps. Germany had signed an unconditional surrender. The following day, the announcement reached the front. Victory in Europe. VE Day. For 6 years, the largest war Europe had ever known was over. No one quite knew how to react. Some men shouted. Some hugged one another. Some laughed. Others simply sat down exactly where they were standing, too exhausted to celebrate, too overwhelmed to think. One soldier quietly removed his helmet, looked at the sky, and began crying. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly. The tears came without warning. Months of fear, grief, relief, all escaping at once. The guns slowly fell silent. After years of constant explosions, the silence felt almost unnatural. Many veterans later admitted they couldn't sleep that first peaceful night. They had become so accustomed to artillery that the absence of it felt wrong. Some woke repeatedly, certain they had missed the sound of incoming shells. Old habits survive long after danger disappears. Across Europe, the celebrations began. Church bells rang. Crowds filled the streets. Flags appeared from windows where they had been hidden for years. Strangers embraced one another. Music returned to city squares. Children laughed without flinching at distant explosions. For the first time in years, millions of people could imagine tomorrow without war. But not everyone celebrated. Some stood quietly beside freshly dug graves. Some unfolded letters they would never mail. Some stared at empty bunks inside crowded barracks. Victory has always carried a terrible companion: memory. Every celebration reminded someone of the friend who should have been standing beside them, the brother who never came home, the medic who crossed one field too many, the radio operator whose last message ended in static. Peace had arrived. They hadn't. That evening, your platoon gathered one final time. The same men who had crossed the Atlantic together. The same men who had survived Normandy. The hedgerows. The frozen forests of Bastogne. Some seats were empty now. No one mentioned them. They didn't need to. Everyone knew exactly who belonged there. Someone quietly raised a tin cup. No speech. No toast. Just a simple sentence. To the ones who made it. He paused. And the ones who didn't. Every cup lifted silently. No one drank immediately, because in that moment, victory didn't feel like winning. It felt like surviving. Late that night, you walked alone beyond the camp. The stars looked exactly as they had before the war. Unchanged. Indifferent. The wind carried the smell of spring across the fields. Birds had begun singing again. Nature had moved on, as it always does. You closed your eyes and tried to remember the sound of your hometown. The train station, the front porch, your mother's voice calling you inside for dinner. They felt impossibly distant now, like memories from another lifetime. Then you realized something. The war had ended, but the journey home was only beginning, because the hardest battle for many soldiers wouldn't be fought in Europe. It would be fought after they returned home. The journey home should have felt triumphant. Instead, it felt strangely quiet. The same ocean that had once carried you toward war now carried you away from it. The ships were different, not in appearance, in atmosphere. Months earlier, the decks had been filled with nervous conversations, forced laughter, and young men wondering what combat would be like. Now, many of those voices were gone. Some had fallen in Normandy, others in the hedgerows, some beneath the snow of the Ardennes. The bunks they once occupied stood empty. No one needed to say why. The Atlantic looked exactly the same. Gray water stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The waves rolled against the hull with the same steady rhythm. The sunsets painted the sky with the same shades of orange and crimson. Nature had remained completely unchanged. Only the men watching it had changed. You spent hours leaning against the rail, watching the wake disappear behind the ship, trying to remember the person who had crossed this same ocean years earlier. The young recruit with polished boots. The one who worried about passing inspections. The one who thought war was something that happened to other people. He felt like a stranger now. Conversations returned slowly. Not about battles. Rarely about Germany. Instead, men talked about ordinary things. Baseball. Fishing. Their father's workshop. The smell of fresh bread. Whether the old dog back home would still recognize them. It was as though everyone was reaching desperately for pieces of the life they'd left behind, trying to convince themselves it still existed. One evening, someone produced a deck of cards. Within minutes, a small game had formed. Laughter followed. Real laughter. Not the nervous kind from training camp. Not the exhausted kind heard between battles. For the first time in years, the laughter carried no fear behind it. The war was finally far enough away. That joy no longer felt like borrowed time. Days later, the coastline appeared. America. Some men rushed toward the rails. Others remained where they were, unable to move. The Statue of Liberty slowly emerged through the morning mist. Several soldiers removed their helmets without realizing they had done so. No one cheered immediately. The moment felt too large for that. Instead, the deck felt almost completely silent. One man whispered, "We made it." No one corrected him. Even those who hadn't had somehow come home with them. The docks overflowed with people. Bands played patriotic songs. American flags waved from every direction. Reporters pushed through crowds searching for interviews. Children climbed onto their fathers before they had even stepped completely off the gangplank. Mothers cried openly. Wives laughed and cried at the same time. The entire country seemed determined to celebrate, and many soldiers genuinely tried to celebrate with them. Then you saw your family, standing exactly where they had promised they would be. Your mother looked older. Your father moved a little slower than you remembered. Your younger brother, somehow, was taller than you. Time hadn't waited while you were away. It had continued, without asking permission. Your mother hugged you first, so tightly that for a moment, it became difficult to breathe. She didn't care. Neither did you. Your father stepped forward afterward. He smiled, then quietly shook your hand. Halfway through, the handshake became an embrace. Neither of you mentioned it afterward. Some moments belong only to fathers and sons. Home looked smaller. The streets, the houses, even your childhood bedroom. Everything felt familiar, yet strangely distant. The baseball glove still hung where you'd left it. The old dresser still stood beside the window. Your books remained neatly stacked on the shelf. It looked as though the young man who had left years earlier might return at any moment. But he never would, because he no longer existed. Neighbors stopped by constantly. They wanted stories. What was D-Day really like? Did you ever see Hitler? How many Germans did you kill? The questions usually came from kindness, sometimes curiosity, rarely from understanding. You answered politely, most of the time. Other stories you kept to yourself. How could you explain the smell of Omaha Beach, or Bastogne in winter, or the silence inside the concentration camps? Some experiences don't become smaller when spoken aloud. They simply become harder for other people to imagine. At night, sleep remained elusive. A truck backfiring outside made your heart race. Fireworks on the 4th of July sounded too much like artillery. Sometimes you woke before dawn, certain someone had shouted your name. It took several long seconds to remember where you were. No foxhole, no bunker, no incoming shells. Just home. Safe. Yet your mind hadn't received the message. People called you a hero. You smiled. Thanked them. Moved the conversation somewhere else. Because when you thought about heroes, you remembered different faces. The medic who crossed open sand. The lieutenant who stood up on Omaha Beach. The friend who handed you his final letter. The men whose names would forever remain carved into white crosses overseas. Those were the people you thought about whenever someone thanked you for your service. Years passed. The uniform was folded carefully into a closet. Life slowly resumed. Jobs, families, children, grandchildren. From the outside, everything looked ordinary again. But every veteran understood something few civilians ever could. You never truly leave the battlefield. You simply learn to carry it differently. And sometimes, usually in the quiet moments, it still comes back. The smell of rain, the sound of distant thunder, the sight of snow falling silently through pine trees. Suddenly, you're 20 years old again, standing somewhere in Europe, waiting for dawn, waiting for the next order, waiting to survive one more day. The war had ended. History had moved on. But for the men who fought it, part of it would always remain. Years passed quietly. The medals are placed inside drawers. The uniforms are folded carefully into old boxes. Photographs begin fading around the edges. Children grow up. Grandchildren arrive. The world changes. New wars are fought. New generations inherit freedoms they never had to fight for. Life moves on, as it always does. But every now and then, an old man pauses, maybe while tying his shoes, maybe while sitting on his porch at sunset, maybe while hearing an airplane pass overhead. And for just a moment, he isn't 85 years old anymore. He's 20, cold, wet, standing in the surf off Omaha Beach, waiting for the ramp to fall. Memory doesn't ask permission. It simply arrives. People often asked veterans the same question. What was the war like? Most answered with a smile. Oh, it was a long time ago. Then they'd change the subject. Not because they had forgotten, because they remembered too well. How do you explain to someone what fear smells like? How do you describe the silence after an artillery barrage? How do you tell a stranger about the best friend whose face you can still remember, but whose voice has slowly faded with time? Some stories remained too heavy for words. As the years passed, their numbers quietly grew smaller. The reunions became quieter. The rows of chairs became shorter. Every year, another familiar face was missing, another empty seat, another handshake that would never happen again. Eventually, there were only a handful left. Old men walking slowly with canes, looking at faded photographs of young soldiers who still smiled from another lifetime. One by one, they returned to Normandy, some for anniversaries, some alone, standing on those same beaches where they had once arrived as frightened boys. The ocean looked exactly the same. The tide still rolled gently onto the sand. Children played where machine guns had once fired. Families laughed where medics had once searched desperately for survivors. Nature had healed the land. Time had healed much of Europe. Some wounds never completely disappear. They walked through the military cemeteries, endless rows of white marble crosses stretching toward the horizon, perfectly aligned, perfectly silent. Each one carried a name, an age, a date. Some carried no name at all, only 3 heartbreaking words. Known unto God. The veterans always seemed to stop longest at those graves, because somewhere, beneath one of those markers, might rest the friend whose final moments no one witnessed. People sometimes say, the greatest generation. It's a phrase we hear so often that it almost loses its meaning. But standing among those graves, you begin to understand. Greatness wasn't measured by medals, or victories, or speeches. It was measured by ordinary people doing extraordinary things, because history demanded it. A farm boy from Iowa, a mechanic from Detroit, a teacher from Kansas, a dock worker from New York. None of them believed they would become part of history. They simply answered a letter. Then they crossed an ocean. Many never returned. Those who did rarely called themselves heroes. They became fathers, electricians, truck drivers, teachers, police officers, business owners, neighbors. They built homes instead of foxholes, raised children instead of rifles. They spent the rest of their lives creating the peace they had once fought to protect. Perhaps that was their greatest victory. Today, very few remain. The voices that once filled troop ships crossing the Atlantic have grown almost silent. Soon, there will be none left to tell these stories from memory. Only letters, photographs, film reels, and the quiet rows of white crosses overlooking the sea. That is why remembering matters. Not to glorify war. War has never needed glorification, only remembrance. Because behind every statistic was a young man with dreams. Behind every casualty report was a family waiting by the mailbox. Behind every grave was a life that should have lasted decades longer. If you ever find yourself standing on Omaha Beach, go early, before the crowds arrive. Listen carefully. The waves sound peaceful now, almost gentle. It's difficult to imagine that this quiet shoreline once echoed with the loudest sounds many young Americans would ever hear. Stand there for a moment. Look toward the water. Imagine thousands of small landing craft emerging from the morning mist. Imagine frightened 20-year-olds gripping cold rifles with shaking hands. Imagine the courage it took to step forward, knowing many never would again. History isn't only found in books. Sometimes, it's carried by the tide, because in the end, this story was never really about battles, or generals, or maps. It was about ordinary people who were asked to do something almost impossible. Some paid with years, some paid with scars, some paid with their lives. All of them paid a price. And because they did, millions of people they would never meet would grow up in a world they helped save. Perhaps that's the quiet truth history teaches us. The greatest acts of courage are rarely performed by people who believe they're extraordinary. They're performed by ordinary people who decide to take one more step when every instinct tells them to stop. And as long as their stories are remembered, they never truly march alone.